Please welcome Mr. Walter Grondzik. The stage is yours. Thank you.
I'm not going to stand up near the podium because I don't feel like I need to be lecturing to you. I think we need to engage in a discussion. Plus, there's less chance of me falling off the stage if I'm down here on the ground. So if you don't mind, I'll be working from here. I'll try not to move around too much for the recording. I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to the organizers of the workshop for the invitation to be here today. It's a great pleasure to present. I'm a really strong fan and proponent of the building commissioning process. I think it's really invaluable to us in the building industry and also out of the building industry in terms of building owners and the public who occupies buildings, that we do the best job possible to make our buildings what they truly can be. So what I'd like to do is to, and we've talked about this a little bit, is to leave a fair amount of time at the end for questions, because that might be more useful actually than just a one-way, which wouldn't even be a dialogue, sort of a monologue. I want to also thank the translators. You did an excellent job, in my opinion, this morning, the interpreters, and that allowed me to hear quite a bit of background information. One thing I can take away from that is that it's a really large world, but it's also fairly small. A lot of the issues are absolutely universal, even though we may be talking lira, euros, or dollars. At the end of the day, we have pretty much the same problem sets that we're trying to deal with. So let me go ahead and jump in so that we do have some time available to us. You've seen this introduction. I do need to say, though, that I am presenting ASHRAE's view of the commissioning process. I am not representing ASHRAE at this meeting. So anything I say is my fault, not ASHRAE's fault. Anything I say is my opinion, not necessarily ASHRAE's opinion. That's not a way to get out of the situation. It's not a cop-out, as we'd say in the US. It's just a reality. I'm not a member of the board of directors of ASHRAE. So what I'd like to do is to talk about a little bit of history of commissioning within ASHRAE, which is primarily, although it's an international organization, this history is primarily US and Canada based. And I think that's just a reality of the background. I'd like to talk a little bit about why building commissioning. I don't know that that's really critical, but when we're trying to expand the scope of commissioning to get more buildings involved, coming back to this question of why becomes maybe a really critical thing for those who aren't quite on board yet. So we've heard this morning, for instance, that hospitals as a building typology, you don't have to really ask that question if you understand the issues that are at play. But for other building types, it's a valid question, and we should address that a little bit. And then I'd like to talk about an overview of the process as seen by ASHRAE. I think that's fairly common within Europe, with the exception of the United Kingdom. In the UK, commissioning is built into local legislation or national legislation, and it's really hard to change that process because it's been legislated. And so there's a different approach to commissioning within the UK than there is in Europe, in the US, and large parts of Asia. Then I'd like to talk about sort of where we are today. And this is all going to happen fairly quickly, and then do a summary, and then hopefully we'll have opportunity for some really intriguing questions. And I didn't talk to you about this ahead of time, but if people feel more comfortable asking questions in Turkish, you can translate for me. Okay. I don't want anyone's questions to go unasked because of lack of comfort. So anything's fair game. So let's talk about a little bit of history first. ASHRAE first formally started its journey in the commissioning process through a document called ASHRAE Guideline 1, and this was published in 1989. And anyone who's been involved with a committee of more than 2 people understands that committees don't work fairly quickly. So this work probably started a decade earlier. And that's sort of where we're coming from. And yes, its title was Guideline for Commissioning of HVAC Systems. So on behalf of ASHRAE, we will take responsibility for the term commissioning. It's our fault. We selected that term. We could have called it penguins or chair. We needed some term, and commissioning seemed to fit. And the background actually, I think, is not commissioning as lots of design professionals understand it, where you will seek and get a commission to design a project. It's a different animal, and it actually, I think, goes back to the testing of naval ships in terms of their preparedness for their duty, essentially fitness for a purpose. And that's what this process is about. So it's not a misnomer, it's not really a bad term, but it's absolutely critically important that anyone who uses the term commissioning be on the same page as someone who's listening to that. Otherwise, there'll be misunderstandings, and there's a lot of that going on. And I'll try to talk about that in sort of my overview of the commissioning process. So this is where we started. In 1996, and don't worry about the dates, but roughly 10 years later, that original standard guideline, was updated, and it now became the HVAC commissioning process. And so what was added in that update was the word process. The word process was not in the first document. I think it became clear to the committee and people in practice that it's really the process we're talking about. And in fact, as we sort of take a look at more of the history, in 2005, essentially the current ASHRAE guideline for commissioning was published, and HVAC disappeared from the title, and it now just says the commissioning process. And there are a number of people who thought that was somewhat risky, who thought it was somewhat of a bold move. Who is ASHRAE? Fundamentally an HVAC organization to talk about a process that could be used to commission bicycles or furniture. And yet, this process is, in our opinion, totally generic. Anything that needs to be quality assured could, in theory, be run through this commissioning process. And I personally feel very adamant about that. If you're designing cutlery, use this process if you want to make sure that it's fit for the purpose that the intended developers had in mind. Bicycles, again, I'll use that example. Buildings, sections of buildings, portions of buildings, subsystems, and so forth. But because ASHRAE is, again, an HVAC organization, it couldn't ignore the HVAC in our part of the mixture. And so subsequent to the 2005 date, another committee worked on providing technical guidance for the commissioning of HVAC in our systems. So this is a support document to Guideline 0. If you're going to commission an HVAC system, ASHRAE recommends that you understand the process, which is in 0. Sorry for these weird numbers. And then that if you're looking for more detailed implementation, sort of boots on the ground information, you would then go to 1.1. So that's sort of the history. And that doesn't bring us up to current, but that's coming up, as you can see, when we get down to current status. But there's been little change, actually, in the ASHRAE documents since 2005 and 2007, respectively. There have been tweaks, there have been editorial changes, but the process, in essence, has not changed. So why commissioning? And I'd like to use a case study that was developed by the Florida Solar Energy Center. It had nothing to do with commissioning. This is a research organization. They were concerned about reports of uncontrolled airflow in small commercial buildings. So they did an investigation. I'll give you the summary of that. They looked at 70 small commercial buildings, and these are basically street front, sort of large-scale residential commercial buildings. I think that typology is common throughout the world. So we're not talking about multi-story office buildings. We're talking typically about 1 or 2 story, low-rise, perhaps commercial projects, medical offices, and that sort of thing. So they studied the 70 buildings, and of the 70 buildings studied in red, only one was deemed to be a good building. And good in their mind was a building that didn't have large quantities of uncontrolled airflow. And uncontrolled airflow is normally not a good thing in a building because nature is taking over, doing what it wants to do, as opposed to what the design team intended for the building to do in terms of breathing, ventilation, and also infiltration control. And so their conclusion, and again, this had nothing to do with commissioning, they're looking at airflow, was whether a building will avoid serious or even catastrophic problems due to uncontrolled airflow is primarily a matter of luck. How do we, as design professionals, tell an owner that our luck is better than someone else, so they should hire us? That's essentially unconscionable. We need to convince an owner that we aren't just rolling dice and working with luck, that we have scientific principles, we have knowledge and experience. And we need to demonstrate that through our buildings. So to me, this is just the best case study of why we need commissioning that I have seen, because it's so simple. You might ask, what are the uncontrolled airflows that they found in the building? Some of them actually are trivial. They increase energy use a small amount. Some are quite serious, such as bathroom exhaust fans venting into a common plenum across an entire building typology. In other words, the exhaust, it happened on a Friday afternoon perhaps. The contractor ran the ductwork from the bathroom exhaust fan up into the plenum. It was 5 o'clock, everybody left, came back the next Monday. Nobody thought about it. So there are health implications there. And as you get into more complex building, I think those health implications become even more serious. So my question is, should we go with luck or go with commissioning? And I'll vote for commissioning pretty much every time. There were 3 major conclusions also that were enunciated by the Florida Solar Energy Center study. And one of those was that uncontrolled airflow was pervasive in buildings. They did a study of 70 buildings, so that's their sample size. 69 out of 70 came back in the wrong direction. They came back negative, if you want. That's pervasive. And my contention is, if we grabbed another 70 buildings, 20 years in the future, if we grabbed 700 buildings, we would find essentially the same results in buildings that are not commissioned. That's a hypothesis on my part, it's not a fact. Building practitioners lack the training methods and insight necessary to understand and avoid uncontrolled airflow in buildings. That's an education problem, but we can handle that. Given proper attention, problematic airflows in buildings can be virtually eliminated. So if we care and we enunciate that that's a concern, they believe we can handle it, and I do also. So in shorter English, the first bullet is basically stuff happens. There's other words for stuff, but things that are not really good happen. They happen for many reasons, in many cases, essentially out of our control, but we can mitigate them. And the stuff can be mitigated. And to me, the antidote to this stuff happening is the building commissioning process. If we move away from everyday buildings, which was the title of the case study, these were just run-of-the-mill buildings, a building that was built probably for a reasonably low first cost, wasn't trying to become a building that would be a model for a publication, wasn't looking for design awards, but it was housing some function with human beings as occupants. If we move away from these everyday buildings, which are all over the place, all over the world, built on a daily basis, and we start to take a look at non-everyday buildings, and I'm even including energy efficient buildings in there because I don't have statistics, but I think the vast majority of buildings throughout the world that are constructed meet energy codes. A fewer percentage exceed those energy codes. And some do an exemplary job just passing the energy codes and going to net zero energy. So even if we're looking at energy efficiency, I think commissioning makes sense. And it's starting to be written into, at least in the US, it's starting to be written into the baseline standards that are the basis for our energy codes, such as ASHRAE 90.1. If we take a look at green buildings, which again are becoming more and more prevalent and popular throughout the world. It's my chance to take a pulpit here, so I do have my definition of green buildings here. I would never conflate the word green and sustainable. I think they're very, very different words, and we need to collectively understand the difference of those. But if we're looking at green buildings, commissioning is a part of, for instance, the certification process under the United States Green Building Council's LEED program. You cannot get certified if you don't employ commissioning on the project. And that's, again, a voluntary process. It's not government mandated, but it has started to move the curve in the US and Canada a fair amount because a lot of owners are interested in getting a green certification. And if they do a little bit of research on that, they understand that there's commissioning. They may ask the questions, what's that mean? And then if we go to even maybe more complex building typologies, such as net zero energy or in Europe, I think the more common approach is to look at carbon rather than energy, look at carbon neutral buildings. I don't personally see how we can get there without commissioning. There are so many new parts, there are so many things that require more observation, more forethought than in a common building that we really need to consider that. So that's not quite it. When I talk about the overview, I'll also try to talk a little bit more about why and bring that back again. But I'd like to give a 5,000 meter picture, if you would, fairly quickly of the ASHRAE process. And let me go back to terminology. I mentioned ASHRAE will take the blame for the term commissioning. We had to call it something. When the first true commissioning process document came out, the new Guideline 0, the committee that worked on that spent literally about 10 hours, not all in one day, but spent 10 hours debating whether or not the title of that document should be the commissioning process or a commissioning process. And at the end of the debate, it was basically this: if you believe in what we just spent 4 years working on, if you believe what we wrote, it can't just be another document. So we'll call it the process and people can push back. That's certainly fair. But to call it a process basically means you're indifferent. And I don't think that's fair. We shouldn't be indifferent. We can adopt a process. So yes, in Turkey, it probably is irrational or maybe partly unreasonable for you to just grab the ASHRAE documents and say, these will work perfectly in this context. But I would say it's a starting point. It's always easier to work from a sheet of paper that's got some notes on it than from a blank sheet of paper. The nice thing about having some notes on a sheet of paper is you can actually look at them and go, no, I don't agree with that. And then that's a rational approach. I thought I'd come back to that little debate about terminology. So this is my graphic envisionment of the commissioning process. We have a building acquisition process on the left-hand side in gray. We have arbitrarily in ASHRAE declared that we will designate phases of the building acquisition process, again with names, and those names can be debated, but we need to call them something. So we start with pre-design, which could be programming or in the UK briefing, but that's when the basic concept of the project is outlined. And I'm a real fan of pre-design, and I'm a real fan of OPR, Owner's Project Requirements, which came up over and over in this morning's panels. And then we move into the design phase. It's possible to subdivide the design phase into schematic, conceptual, design development. You can even subdivide it further than that. But there's a block of things that happen in the design phase that are different than pre-design and different than construction, and that's why the names are applied. Then the project, if it's successfully budgeted and everything's working well, will go out for construction. That could be a multi-year process. It could be a couple of months. It was interesting to hear about fast construction in Turkey. So I don't know, this could be 3 weeks maybe, I don't know. How fast is the construction here? Not that fast? Just seeing if you're listening or not. Okay. So not 3 weeks. Certainly, the faster the construction process, the faster the timeline, the more structure you need on your quality assurance process so it doesn't get in the way of desirable speed. On the other hand, speed sort of as an asset to itself probably needs to be debated a little bit. You can do a very effective job of accomplishing something only to find out that what you accomplished was not effective. So you need to be efficient in being effective, and they have to balance somehow. And that balance will typically be project specific. To the right-hand side on the screen is the building commissioning process in 3 words. And those 3 words, which occur over and over and over again across the phases, are documentation, evaluation, and communication. To me, those are the 3 unassailable, absolutely minimum requirements for the building commissioning process. We need to document, we need to communicate, and we need to evaluate. And those things happen over and over again until we end the process at some point into occupancy and operations where the project's been handed over to the owner and they're taking beneficial use of the project. In the US, that's usually about a year, give or take, approximately, and that's contractually defined for each project. And then we move into ongoing occupancy, which for a government or university owner, that could be 100 years or more. And the commissioning process is shown as terminating just briefly into occupancy and operations. That's the idea of ongoing commissioning, which again came up in the panel this morning. It's a brilliant idea. Why train, for instance, for a marathon run to be successful in the marathon run and then stop training? If you have something going, continue that. So the formal ASHRAE definition in Guideline 0 of commissioning is a quality-focused process. So process is key, and I've highlighted that, put it in bold. For enhancing the delivery of a project, the process focuses on verifying and documenting that the facility and all of its systems and assemblies are planned, designed, installed, tested, operated, and maintained to meet the owner's project requirements. So that's a fairly short definition of the term commissioning. It's also unfortunately easy to misinterpret that because it says all of its systems and assemblies, and that's actually not the intention. It should say all of the systems and assemblies that are to be commissioned, because Guideline 0 does not require that we do whole building commissioning. That's not the case. You can selectively pick and choose what you'd like to commission, and that's the only rational approach there. My elevator pitch, much shorter, would be commissioning is a structured, and the structure is actually in the document that we're looking at, Guideline 0 or Standard 202. That's the format, that's the structure that helps us define what this process means. So it's a structured quality assurance process intended to ensure that a building meets the owner's requirements upon first occupancy. And we tend to use bold terms like first occupancy, day one. What we don't want is for a building to be occupied for 5 years before someone can figure out how to make it thermally comfortable. That's just not acceptable for the people who are occupying and using a building. So maybe it's day one, maybe it's 5 days in, but it can't be 5 years into the project. And it also basically assumes that we understand what the owner wants, the owner's requirements. And those to me are quite critical. So what commissioning is and isn't, it's an ongoing process. According to ASHRAE, and on their behalf according to me this afternoon, it must span from pre-design through design into construction and somewhat into occupancy and operations, again, roughly a year. If someone chooses to start the commissioning process in construction, I'm going to call foul. I'm going to say, no, you can't do that. And according to ASHRAE's guidelines, the answer is no, you can't do that. Because in construction, you've skipped two really absolutely critical phases of the process, which would be design and pre-design. It's not just an event, it's not a short-term task, and it's not problem clearance. Those are parts of the commissioning process. Those are not the process. They're much too narrow-minded to be called commissioning. In my opinion, and personal opinion, you can commission, again, anything from bicycles to buildings to airplanes to ships. The process is fairly generic. And so you can definitely do whole buildings. That's rarely done today because of expense, and it's not necessarily logical to do that in a lot of projects. You can do building systems. One of the debates that took some time again within ASHRAE was because it's an HVAC organization, the focus seemed to be that if it doesn't consume electricity and rotate, we don't want to talk about it. So essentially there was a thought process, there was a group of people who said, we do not want to talk about this process being applied to static systems, non-electromechanical systems. Luckily that was broken down because you can in fact commission passive systems such as building enclosure systems, and that's actually the fastest growing, the largest growing area of building commissioning in the US and Canada. It's exceeding in terms of revenue the commissioning of electrical mechanical systems. And I think that's because owners somehow discover this process and go, my building doesn't have to leak. You know, it actually can be tight, it can be airtight. Wow, let's do this. You can do building subsystems. And the footnote at the bottom is you can only do this if you understand what the owner's project requirements are. And let me digress from the slides for a minute. Let's assume that you hired me at some fair rate. I heard 100 pounds an hour this morning. I'll do that. So for 100 pounds an hour, you've asked me to come in and evaluate this podium. And all I can do literally is, it's got my name on it, so I like that. White's fine. I cannot commission this podium. I can't do an evaluation of the podium without understanding the owner's project requirements, because I will miss something like, oh, yeah, it was supposed to be touchscreen. Or there was an occupancy sensor and there isn't one. I need to understand what the owner truly wanted to get, what their success target was. What does the owner declare to be success in this particular area? Then I can evaluate it. And yes, I'd like a third-party evaluator. I don't want the person who assembled this to be the evaluator. I don't want the person who designed this. They're all biased. I want someone whose bias is on the part of the owner. If they have any bias, it's because they want the owner to get what they think they're getting. And so we need the OPR. I know I'm being kind of vocal about that, but it's absolutely critical. Fairly small slide, so if you're in the back, you can't read these. If you're in the front, you may not be able to read these either. But basically, this is the 4 phases of the project. And the message on this slide is basically that the commissioning process has to intervene, and I mean intervene in a positive way. It's not being nosy. It's not being picky. Yes, we want someone to say no if they should say no. We need a group, an expert, a team, to basically say during the pre-design phase, there's something missing. And we need to fix that. And the earlier we fix it, the less likelihood it's going to be an expensive problem down the line. During the design phase, the commissioning team, and again, it's not one person, it's a team, takes a look at the design artifacts. And so, for instance, if the client, excuse me, I'm going to go to the US for a minute. If the client wants a LEED Platinum building, during the design phase, the commissioning team will be looking at the design artifacts and going, there's no way you can get there. What we're looking at will not get you LEED Platinum. Rather know that now than before construction is done. So all of this is front-loading problem solutions and trying to get clarity to the process. Same thing during construction. All sorts of stuff happens during the construction. It's really easy for designers to villainize contractors, but contractors in many cases I think are trying to do the best they can. They just may not have correct information. And so the commissioning process, the commissioning team intervenes at that point. And then once we hand the project over to the occupants, to the owner more correctly, why would we expect that they will understand what to do with this building? My contention, which I would love to hear someone rebut, is that if you buy, I'm going to lowball this, if you buy a 25,000 euro Mercedes, so maybe it's used, you will get a better user's manual than if you buy a $25 million building. The Mercedes user's manual has been proofread, it's been checked, it has good graphics in it. It's not just a bunch of loose leaf sheets of paper thrown into a cardboard box. So we can do better by the owners. In the commissioning process, we heard this morning, documents, documents, documents. Yes, there are a lot of them. And we can assemble those in a way that they're usable for the owner. So more and more large projects, such as hospitals, are going with web-based user's manuals, essentially word searchable. So I don't have to actually go through 5,000 pages of material to find out where it says oil filter. I just type in oil filter and every instance would pop up. There's an expense involved with that, but that can actually save the owner money in the long time. And we can put training materials into that using electronics. So anyways, that's a picture of this. And then the continuity of the commissioning team across the project phases helps to tie these things together, which is also important because they can tend to wander and fly apart a little bit as we move through the process. So I believe that the benefits of commissioning are you get a project that reflects the owner's needs and desires. And yes, we may actually have to grab the owner and twist their arm in a gentle, happy way to get them to tell us what they really want. But it's really good to do that because if it's not what they want, they'll tell you later. I just as soon find out as early as possible what they truly want, and then we can see about making that work. You get a project that works fully upon initial occupancy. And you know, that's an ideal statement. In the reality of digital controls, there's probably still code writing going on in the 10th week of occupancy. But that shouldn't be critical code writing for controls. Otherwise, we've sort of failed the owner. They don't want their building to be an experimental lab. They want it to be a productive facility. A project that's well documented. So there is actually a use, I think, for the documents. And there are a lot of them. Facility staff who can actually properly operate the building. The solution to every problem isn't duct tape and a hammer and a piece of wood. You know, and I'm not, again, dumping on staff, but why would we expect staff who maybe has 30 years of experience in a particular type of system, I know this is dated, but let's say pneumatic controls, why would we expect them to automatically wake up one morning and be able to work with digital controls? So we need to understand the ability of staff, and we need to work with those abilities to get them on board so they can properly maintain a building. So the new building is not an enemy, but rather something they're trying to support. We'll have clear performance benchmarks, and we actually heard that this morning, and I think that's really powerful. So when the building was turned over to the owner, for instance, in terms of energy utilization index, we actually have probably in some cases a documented EUI value. And we can monitor this really easily and fairly low cost basis so that 3 years in, if the EUI has crept up, we can ask questions why. And it may be a rational reason. We added more people. The office expanded. We put in a lot more computer equipment. But if we can't answer why has it crept up, we at least have the benchmark to say, can we go back to this location? And again, I think that's really valuable. We also have a project that benefits from the collaborative effort of diverse participants through this thing called the commissioning team.
Last 15.
Okay, thank you. So from a 5,000 meter view, using SI units instead of IP, to me, commissioning is essentially a process that facilitates, encourages, and rewards. And I think it's a win-win-win proposition for everyone involved when it goes well. Having in place, through the commissioning process, effective communications, effective documentation, and verification or evaluation. And again, I think everyone can win. Contractor can win, occupants can win, the owner can win, the design team members can win, and the owner can win. It's hard to argue against win-win-win. You have to also believe that I'm telling you the truth on that. And this has to occur across all project phases and all the active disciplines on the project. And it's, again, conducted by a team. That came up on the panel this morning. I would like to talk about that just briefly. I have a little bit more time than I thought, so appreciate that. On a complex building, let me go back to hospitals because that came up several times this morning. And it's an atypical building type in terms of square meters of construction per year. But it's an interesting sort of example project typology. I had fairly long-term discussions with the manager of a major healthcare organization in the state of California in the United States. And two things stuck with me absolutely. One was talking to people on the commissioning team, sort of as a kickoff talk. To you, this is an issue. You've written something in the issues log, and to you, it's an issue. To me, as the facility manager, it's a potential $10 million lawsuit. So perspective is really critical, and the idea of risk management. Now, I know in the US we're really litigious. We sue people all the time. But it also could be human health, or it could involve human life. And so in some cases, we need to really take a look at risk management. I don't really care too much what my return on investment is if I can save lives by identifying an issue and taking care of it. The other thing that the same person said was they had a kickoff meeting of potential bidders for the commissioning process on a project. And so he said, here's what I'd like you to do for me. Here's my view of success. The first year of operation of the new hospital, I get no phone calls, there are no faults. Half the room laughed, and he said, anybody who laughed can leave, because you're not serious, and I am. Now, it won't be no faults, but that sets the stage. It says, this is what I'm looking for, and maybe it's physically impossible today, but it's not business as usual. And again, I appreciate that sort of thing because it's coming from the owner, and this is an owner's process. Also today, let's keep sticking with hospitals. This is not going to be a one-person show. There's no one person today that I've identified who can, for instance, walk up to I'm going to revert to IP units, to a 2,000-ton chiller. So we're talking about a big hulking thing here, large capacity, and optimize that. And then walk into the next room and take a look at an emergency transfer switch emergency generator and optimize that. And then walk over to the building enclosure and take a look at the curtain wall and optimize that as part of the commissioning process, those are different human beings, different skill sets, different expertise. The commissioning process doesn't have to flinch from that. It's a management process. Whoever I need on a project with the expertise I need, I will bring onto the project. So my perception, I would say, of the ideal commissioning authority or provider is someone who really can work with people, doesn't irritate people on a daily basis, can convince them to do things that are in their own best interest by explaining, and knows where to get the expertise required for a project. The days of one person commissioning, except on the smallest residential projects, I think are probably gone because buildings are becoming so complicated. So a real quick overview, and this is maybe unnecessary, but one thing I think this session presentation can do is sort of bring everybody back together. So let's call this a summary rather than new information, if you would. During pre-design, the owner gains an understanding of the commissioning process and helps to develop a RFP for commissioning. And they can do that on their own, or people who are trying to get business can help them understand the process, but an owner has to be on board because it's their process, in my opinion. You'll hire a commissioning provider. The provider and the owner together will determine the scope of the process for that project and the budget. And the budget can't be in contingency funding because it won't be there, it'll disappear. So I would like to actually have an escrow account in a separate bank that says commissioning account so that it's there and it's available. Maybe it's not going to happen, but it has to be a serious budget. It can't just be miscellaneous. Develop a commissioning plan, which is the roadmap for the process from pre-design through occupancy and operations. And that roadmap will be detailed for the design phase and pre-design and somewhat murky and vague for occupancy, but it'll get better as we move forward. Develop the owner's project requirements, and again, that's absolutely essential. How do you verify the success of something that doesn't have any success or target benchmarks? We need the OPR, and it has to be fairly good. Develop commissioning services requirements for the design team professional services contract. You don't want to have a design team come on board and then maybe a month into the process, you call them up or go over to their office and say, by the way, I think I forgot to tell you, we're commissioning this project. Is that okay with you? Because the answer should be no, it's not okay. You have a fee proposal. It didn't include commissioning. That's a whole new ballgame. So the services contracts between the owner and the design professionals need to include commissioning. Otherwise, you're asking them to do something for free, and that's not going to happen. If you're going to use checklists to evaluate the design artifacts, those need to be developed in pre-design because they'll be used in the next phase, and then the owner accepts all this because it's all an owner's process. So again, quickly in the design phase, there will be a whole bunch of commissioning team meetings. That's the communication aspect. We'll verify a document called the Basis of Design, which is an attempt for the design team to talk about their solution to the owner's project requirements. So why did you use an air-cooled chiller versus a water-cooled chiller? Why did you use fan-powered VAV versus box-powered VAV? Just sort of document that. And most firms have done that. It's just that it goes into someone's drawer here, someone's drawer here. So this is more work, it's more effort. But then this can also be conveyed to the contractor so that they don't waste a lot of time proposing substitutions or changes that just don't make sense on the project. Again, maybe idealistic, but useful. Develop training programs for O&M personnel and also occupants. Review the design phase documents against the OPR. Update the OPR and the commissioning plan as necessary because of changes to the client's project scope and so forth. During the construction phase, facilitate communications, update. Implement the checklist and test procedures that have been developed to make sure that the systems are installed and working as they should before they're handed over to the owner. Implement the training plan. If the training plan includes teaching, educating, training occupants, that will be deferred until occupancy because they're not available during construction. And then also verify the systems manual, and the owner can accept this and move on and take over the project with constructive occupancy. During operations and occupancy phase, update. Coordinate through this process contractor callbacks. And this is actually where the contractor can get some serious win. The fewer callbacks, the less money they're spending at the end of the project. and the easier life should be. Verify that the training done during occupancy and operations, say for occupants, was done properly. Verify completion and updating the systems manual. Close out the issues log. Convene a lessons learned workshop before everyone gets fully tired and totally broke on terms of budget. So let's chat about what went well, what didn't go so well in this project, so moving forward on the next project we can benefit, and then complete and deliver the final commissioning process report. So that's a really quick overview, but I think it ties together things I heard today. I'm sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, but I'm assuming this morning was somewhat similar to yesterday in terms of thinking about the process and the issues behind it. Important ASHRAE recommendations, and these are ASHRAE recommendations. Number one, in bold with arrows pointing to it. Start the commissioning process in pre-design. If you don't do that, you cannot claim compliance with either ASHRAE Guideline 0 or Standard 202. It's not possible to claim compliance. Hire an independent commissioning provider. We talked about that in panel this morning. Fully support that. Establish a viable commissioning team. The owner will appoint members to the commissioning team. The people that the owner appoints need to have the authority to actually speak in meetings so that they can say, no, this won't work for us. And again, hospitals are, I think, a wonderful example. There are a number of departments within a hospital where there are very, very precise and strict requirements. Someone representing each of those departments needs to be on board in the OPR to say, don't forget about us. Not that the department heads are usually shy, but you've been talking about a lot of things, but from my perspective, making this hospital work on a day-to-day basis, this is what I need in the OPR. The design team is responsible for design. So the commissioning team can suggest areas of concern. They can suggest those loudly. They can carry those areas of concern to the owner, but the design team does the design because they are legally responsible, ethically responsible, and also that's where their emissions and errors insurance resides with them. The contractor is responsible for construction. That's their job. So we can flag things that are not acceptable. We can tell the owner. The owner can decide to stop construction, but we don't get on the job site and say, here's what you ought to do. That's a bad idea. The OPR is the validation benchmark, not just the construction documents. So the commissioning process in terms of validation and evaluation looks at the OPR more than it looks at the construction documents. There are other people on the team whose job it is to look at the construction documents and affirm compliance. The commissioning team's responsibility is to look at the OPR, because quite often no one else is doing that. Consider statistical sampling, because 100% assurance may not be necessary. In some cases, 300% may be necessary. So most people think 0 to 100 for sampling. It can go beyond 100. So for instance, for an absolutely critical aspect on a critical facility, I may want 3 independent people to put independent eyes on the operation of that system because it matters so much. And in other cases, if I sample 5% of the VAV boxes on a 20-story office building that has over 1,000 VAV boxes, if I do 5% and there's a systematic problem, they're just installed incorrectly or something like that, I'll see them on the 5%. And we can come back then and say, you failed the sample test. We're going to come back and revisit. We will not look at those boxes again. We'll look at another 5%. And then, sort of by magic, at some point, everything's fine, or as good as it's going to get. So I really liked, again, this morning, hearing that there were lots of issues on Project 1, fewer on Project 2, fewer on Project 3, fewer on Project 4. As soon as everyone on the project understands that, oh, this is serious, you're actually going to, wait a minute, you're actually going to hold us to these commissioning procedures, things get better because most people can actually do what they need to do. They just need to understand that's going to happen. And everything should be explicitly defined in advance to the extent possible so no one is doing unfunded work. I think we get the OPR, so I'm not going to actually say anything about this. I'll leave the slide up for just a minute. But one more time, the OPR is the basis for the commissioning process. On a single-family residence, the OPR might be 3 pages. On a hospital, it might be, I scare myself when I say this, but it might be 3,000 pages. The ASHRAE commissioning process is fully scalable. It will work on a single-family villa, and it will work on a 250-bed hospital. it takes some common sense to scale it. So you can't get a 3-page OPR for the hospital. You probably haven't listed the various departments in 3 pages. So there has to be a rational application of this. It must address quality as well as quantity. The drawings and specs, well, actually the drawings address quantity, but we also want to talk about quality. And quite often the quality that I'm most interested in, if I was an owner, would not be the number of VAV boxes, it's the number of unhappy, uncomfortable building occupants who are spending so much time complaining about being uncomfortable that they're not doing the work I'm paying them to do. So look beyond just sort of counting things, objects, and artifacts into what the actual outcome should be. The OPR needs to be completed in pre-design, otherwise the design team is designing things without instructions from the owner. They may do a great job, but it will be their building then, it won't be the owner's building. So we need to have OPR in place, done, complete. It can modify itself a little bit, but it has to be handed off to the design team so the design team can go, okay, we can do this. And it's the basis, again, one more time, for all the commissioning process verifications and evaluations. You can't see this, even I can't read it, but this is a typical checklist because verification and evaluation is so important. And this is from ASHRAE Guideline 1.1. And the key point is, in the red oval, the answers on the checklist are yes, no. Yes, we move on with life. No, it goes into the issues log. And it's really easy, and this again came up this morning in the panel, it's really easy to go, well, that's really simple. What's going on here? A yes or a no answer means that someone actually understands the project and the specifications to answer the question, is the piping clean enough? Because that varies from project to project. If I have exposed piping and I'm going to paint it, cleanliness means something different to me than if it's going to be hidden behind a plenum or placed in a mechanical room. When you can't do something with a checklist, and again, this just looks like a bunch of scribbling, that's fine. You move into more complicated situations, which is called a test procedure in Guideline 0. And basically, it's a scripted story of what will be done. And so if I get a little bit closer, I can tell you some of the headings are facility scenarios, background, systems that are going to be evaluated, ambient conditions. We're literally setting up a set of conditions that have to be in place before we can undertake a test. Some of the headings here are issues to be recorded, prerequisites, what has to be in place before this test can happen, and then also participants. Who needs to be on the job site during this test? How are we doing for time? Still?
Last 5 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Another story. A building, architecture building, was remodeled, and a previously open courtyard became an enclosed atrium space. And because of the layout of the building, the path of egress from most of the space went through the atrium. So previously, people left the building into an open courtyard. They were safe. They could wander away from the building. Now they went into an enclosed atrium. So it was a means of egress, and there needed to be a smoke evacuation system in the egress means. And so that's where the test procedures come into play. The fire marshal came in. Everybody said, we're good to go. This is going to be great. You're only going to be here 5 minutes. They set off a smoke bomb in the atrium. The fans came on. The fans came on, got louder and louder and louder, and they eventually burned themselves out. This is like within 5-minute period. Before they burned themselves out, what happened is the electronic signal to open an inlet to provide fresh air to the atrium for the exhaust had not been wired. So just before the fans burned out, the fire marshal said, this is just, I'm out of here. I'm leaving, I'm out of here, call me when you're serious. And tried to leave the building and couldn't because the fans had drawn a negative pressure and the doors opened in the other direction. And so I'm out of here, I'm out of here. That's not someone who's now on your side on any future projects. So we need to script these things. We need to make sure all the prerequisites are in place. We need the right people there when we do a test. So current status, fairly quickly. ASHRAE has a whole array of documents available. On the right-hand side of the slide are the documents for new building commissioning, as I'll call it. We have Guideline 0, which is a guideline. We have Standard 202, which is a standard code mandatory language written document. On the left-hand side, we currently have Guideline 0.2, which is a guideline for the process for existing buildings and systems. And in progress, that's why it's blurred out, is standard 230p, which will be a code mandatory language document for existing buildings and systems. And that's maybe in ASHRAE time, maybe 4 years away, 5 years away, maybe 3, but it's in progress right now. So those are the first 4 on this fairly busy slide. The elements in the middle, under the first horizontal line, are supporting documents. So we've got a supporting document for HVAC systems new, supporting document with technical details, checklist, and so forth for existing HVAC. There's a document to help develop training for the commissioning process, 1.3. Another one for systems manual development for 1.4. We have a document for smoke control systems. And then currently under development in the red text is a new document, a guideline for data systems. That's the first building typology specific ASHRAE guideline. Everything else is process-based. And then below the line, the Illuminating Engineering Society has developed a support document for lighting systems, both daylight and electric, that works really nicely with the ASHRAE process. We have enclosure systems details, which used to be in NIBS Guideline 3, but that responsibility was handed off to another organization. I won't get into all the politics and so forth, but the other organization, which is ASTM, radically changed this as a document, and it requires extensive testing, which is quite expensive beyond what ASHRAE ever had in mind, and it also requires, rather than commissioning reviews, peer reviews. And peer reviews are amazingly expensive, multiple peer reviews. So that one on the bottom is the one that's different than everything else on the list. And these, again, I'll just real quickly say, they work in tandem. So if I don't have any code mandate to do commissioning, I just want to do a good job, I'll pick up Guideline 0. And if I'm doing an HVAC system, I'll try to grab Guideline 1.1. If I'm also doing enclosure, I'll try to grab the NIB document, if it's still available on the web someplace, and it is. So again, this is just another way of saying they pair together. If I am told by some external authority that I need to do commissioning, they've probably told me that through standard 202. So instead of 0, I'll use 202. The main difference between those two, and everything's project specific. So again, it's one process fits all, but not one size fits all. We can adapt. The main difference between 202, which is on the left, and Guideline 0, which has been my focus most of the afternoon, on the right, is that 202 talks about a viable commissioning process, and 0 aspires to be the ideal process. The reason for that is when you get into code language, quite often you have to compromise. So we went from ideal to viable, and actually most people are fairly comfortable with that. 202 is organized around documents, and 0 is organized around project phases. And again, because documents came up so often today, our assumption when we did 202 is that a code official cannot ever physically be observing the process from start to finish. The process of commissioning is occurring in multiple geographic locations. It's spanning multiple years on a large project. No code official can be assigned that duty. But what they can do is look at the documents. And we think that's how code enforcement of the commissioning process will develop over time, that the authority having jurisdiction will ask for documents, look them over, and their professional and personal judgment say this is an adequate OPR, this is an acceptable BOD, and so forth. So in summary, commissioning is structured. Again, the structure is in the documents, the standard and guideline. Quality assurance process that intends to deliver to the owner the building that the owner thought they were getting when they said, let's do this. It's an ongoing process, pre-design through occupancy and operations. Don't start in design, don't start in construction. If you start in occupancy, you're doing something different anyways, and that would be existing building commissioning. It's not an event. You don't have a commissioning weekend. It's not a short-term task. You don't hire someone to come in for a couple of days to commission the project. That's just not correct. I think you can commission pretty much anything. The things in bold are the things that historically in the US and Canada seem to be issues. So for instance, renewable energy systems, they're not that common yet. So doing some commissioning work on them to make sure they perform as intended makes sense. Lighting controls, I don't know what's with lighting controls, but especially daylight sensing and control systems. I've seen statistics that only 50% of them work the way they're supposed to work. So money's being wasted, I would recommend taking a look at commissioning on them. And then DDC controls, because they're just so complicated. Personal recommendations. So stuff happens. This stuff can occur throughout the multi-year process and across the multidisciplines involved with acquiring a building. The bottom line is we're talking about good communications using documents, and that good communication and the use of the documents allows us to verify that the owner is getting what they want at the end of the process. Talked about this, so this is again just summary. We did mention commissioning cost, and I refuse to talk about it. And you might say, well, if you're going to not talk about it, why do you have a slide? The slide is my justification for not talking about it. So here's the bottom line for me. It's going to vary with project type. Hospital versus villa. That's like, duh, okay. But if we throw out a number like X%, people take that, literally, and we can't let that happen. It's going to vary with market conditions. Is it a hot market? Is it a down market? Are firms trying to keep their people on staff and they're willing to underbid to do that? Or is it a hot market where everyone's trying to get the most money they possibly can? What are we going to commission? Are we just doing mechanical or electrical? Or are we going to do elevators and other things, enclosure? It's going to vary with owner expectations. Does the owner think that commissioning is a commodity? In other words, is the reason the owner is doing commissioning to get a point or a credit in a green building rating system? If that's the case, all they want is the point of the credit. And the cheaper they can get that, the more rational that is. On the other hand, if it's a complex building type and it's quality assurance, my guess is that in an array of bids for this service, the owner probably starts to dismiss the lowest one almost automatically. They probably dismiss the highest one and then sort of look in the middle, because you start to ask, what am I missing on this low bid? What did they leave out of the process? What's the gap? It's not an inconsequential expense. It's not zero, because we're overlaying something on top of an existing process. So it's not zero cost. But if you look at it as an investment rather than an expense, and I think more and more people are starting to not even look at it that way, but as a risk management objective. What's the risk involved with doing commissioning versus not doing commissioning? And can you live with the consequences of the unmitigated risk? And that's a project typology specific question. So I think you can get everyday buildings without major glitches if you employ commissioning, and you can get high performance buildings that really work the way you intended them to work if you employ commissioning. So this is from another presentation. I'm not going to apologize for that, but you can see the graphic style changed a little bit. Based on what I heard this morning, I wanted to throw this into the mix just to sort of summarize literally maybe the last couple of words here. In pre-design, we have an array of possible outcomes. Let's just say indoor air quality. I have barely acceptable indoor air quality, somewhere in that spectrum. I have even less than barely acceptable because maybe no one's going to catch it, and I'm really concerned about money. Unethical, but what the heck. And then somewheres over here we have outstanding indoor air quality. During pre-design, someone has to think about that and say, that green point is where this project will be. And I've thought about it, that's what I want, that's what I expect. That's the OPR. Then during the design process, in theory, the design process will lead to outcomes that are congruent with that green dot. But there's going to be some wiggle room in there. And what the commissioning process does, if that wiggle room gets too large, the black line, it brings it back into compliance. And it may just be a nudge or it may be a kick, but we need to get that into compliance. And then during the construction phase, again, ideally the contractor would be fully on board, they're reading the CDs and so forth, but things can happen. And we want to do a nudge there. In some cases, again, it's a kick rather than a nudge. But this is the whole idea of the process to me. Identify what you want, be absolutely specific and clear. It can have tolerances, but I want this. And then throughout the rest of the phases, do what's necessary to bring all the work being done into alignment with that target. And then as we move into occupancy and operations, and the horizontal dash line there is the end of the original commissioning process, entropy will take over. The building will start to do its own thing a little bit. Stuff will happen in the project. That's natural. The basis of the commissioning process is to, again, nudge. So if we're wandering off our EUI value, we'll nudge it. If the CO2 values are increasing beyond what's acceptable. We'll nudge it back again through this process. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we've got time for questions still.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Walter'a teşekkür ediyoruz. Şimdi vaktimizi biraz geçtik. Soru cevaplara geçelim hızlıca. Soru. Buyurun Murat Bey.
What about the total cost target of the owner? Is it part of the OPR, and is commissioning authority has any responsibility about it?
I think at the end of the day, the owner is responsible for that issue. But the commissioning authority and/or team has expertise that can lead to maybe a more rational thought about cost and budgeting. It's highly useful if someone in the room at the time can say, no, you can't do that for the cost you're looking at. Otherwise, we'll have unreasonable expectations, and those will carry through until we have an unsatisfied client at some point. Yeah. Does that respond to your question?
Yes.
Yeah. It's the owner's money in most cases. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Buyurun.
Thank you. You mentioned about the LEED certificate and green buildings. Is there any obligation for HVAC system in order to get LEED certification? Another question is using high efficient equipments. For example, high efficient pumps, zero leakage valve is a plus for LEED certification.
I can respond to the first question. The second one, that's beyond the scope, so sorry about that. Yes, to the first question, the commissioning process is built into USGBC's LEED program, which you specifically asked about, does require that the major energy consuming systems of the building be part of the commissioning process. So LEED has both a prerequisite and a credit. The credit's voluntary, the prerequisite's mandatory. I would say that the prerequisite in LEED, my personal opinion, is 40% maybe of Guideline 0. So I don't think the prerequisite as written by LEED is actually the ASHRAE commissioning process. But when you do the credit, I think you've got the whole package then. So yes, HVAC would fall under that, but not specifically. So it doesn't require that you look at pumps or balancing or tab. It's primarily that it's a major energy consuming system, and so it has to be part of that quality assurance process.
Thank you.
İlkin Bey. Arkada.
Hi, sir. Welcome, Turkey.
Thank you.
This is İlkin Sevigen. Is ASHRAE planning to add a section with a heading of risk management and a kind of template? Are they planning?
Not formally, but there are a lot of people talking about it. So it would not surprise me if that doesn't get added within the next 10 years. That's a long time, I know, but so I don't know of any current plans. No one has actually penciled in on a work plan, add a section on risk management, but I think it would be very, very useful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Azamet Bey. Ortada.
We have a term, especially in LEED documents, called as enhanced commissioning. Could you please briefly explain what is the scope of this enhanced commissioning?
Yes, I'm really glad you asked that question. Thank you. Under LEED, enhanced commissioning means actually doing commissioning. Sorry, I'll elaborate on that. The unenhanced commissioning, the prerequisite, is part of the process. And I don't remember the details, but the part that's missing is actually fairly important. So my take is, if you see the term enhanced commissioning as part of a green building rating system, particularly LEED, cross off the term enhanced, and you're talking about the commissioning process. I think, as envisioned through most of Europe, most of Asia, and the US and Canada, the enhanced process is actually what you should do. So excellent question, because it sounds like you're going beyond the minimum expectations. Actually, by hitting enhanced, you're doing what you should be doing anyways. Now, this is not a shy group of people, I can tell that. So,
And I have a question, Walter, if you mind. During your presentation, I've noticed that there are some new guidelines. They're on the pipeline and where to. And the last one, you mentioned that it was for data centers.
that's true.
And what about the hospitals, sir? Do you plan any guideline for the hospitals, commissioning of hospitals? Because that's some, special proprietary thing, I
Yes.
think.
I could see that happening. Again, I don't know of anything in the pipeline right now. I think
Do you consider to do it? Because I know that there is another institution called ASHE,
Yes.
American Society of Healthcare Engineers, and they have also their own, book, guideline.
Yes.
And what is Ashrae's reaction on that? I mean, do you plan to make any equivalent?
I think it's an excellent question, and I think the situation is this. Remember I said that Ashrae believes that the commissioning process is generic and will fit anything. And if we really truly believe that, then we probably shouldn't be doing a new guideline on data centers, because that contradicts our belief that this will fit any situation. But it turns out that there are, for lots of building typologies, so many specific situations of concern that having additional guidance available would be useful. So I don't know the dynamics of the situation that started it, but someone proposed a guideline on commissioning of data systems. It was approved by the Ashrae Board of Directors as a logical next step for Ashrae. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a proposal in a year for hospitals.
Wow.
I also wouldn't be surprised if there is not one.
Okay.
It depends on the perceived need. In other words, if people who are currently doing hospital work see no true need for a new document, then there'll be no demand for it. One of the things that had to do with data centers is, and I'm not an expert in data centers, but apparently there are grade or class rankings of data centers, depending on their stringency. And that sort of thing is not clearly talked about. It's not enunciated clearly in 202 or 0. And so I know that's one of the things that's going to happen. I believe when the new 1.6 for data centers is published.
1.7 for hospitals.
For hospitals, yes. But I think when 1.6 is published, it may literally say for, what are the classes, 1, 2, 3, or?
Tier 1, Tier 2,
yeah, Tier 1.
3, and Tier 4.
So its organization of this new guideline may literally be Tier 1.
Okay,
Here's what you do.
okay.
Tier 2, forget Tier 1, here's
Okay.
what you do. And Tier 3. And that may help deliver, even though it's common information, in a more digestible format for people who are trying to implement it. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Başka soru? Eric?
Sorry, I would like to come back. You specifically explained what was the meaning of enhanced commissioning. Can I ask the question, what is the meaning of commissioning then?
You may. You're going to stretch my memory, but according to Ashrae, it's a quality-focused, structured process whereby the various participants on the delivery of a project work together to deliver a project that meets the owner's project requirements. So even fewer words. You're about to get on an airplane. You have 2 seconds. I would tell you commissioning is a structured process to deliver the owner's project requirements. And you might ask me, well, why do we need that? Don't they always get them? And I would say, no, rarely do they get their actual requirements.
Okay, I think I just misunderstood then. When you say enhanced commissioning is basically the word enhance means that you are actually doing the commissioning. So then when you don't have the enhance, what do you do?
No, the enhanced is a term coined by USGBC for the LEAD program.
My question was within that terms.
Yeah, I would never use that term. So that's part of the problem. I don't recognize the term enhanced commissioning. There is no such thing to me.
Yeah.
But then someone printed it, so I have to talk about it now and then. So does that help? In other words, if you wanted to talk to me about enhanced commissioning, I'll very politely say no.
Okay.
Let's talk about commissioning.
All right. Okay, so should we conclude that the first level, which is commissioning in a green building, is actually that we don't do commissioning?
No, I would say the first level in a green building, because there's a prerequisite, the focus here is on LEED. There's a prerequisite for commissioning. But if the owner literally thinks that that means they're getting a fully commissioned building, they are absolutely and terribly wrong.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's better now.
Yeah. And I'll say the same thing about TAB. If someone thinks TAB is commissioning, that's just so erroneous. Yes. Not that it's a bad thing.
Buyurun, Deniz Hanım.
Hello, welcome to Turkey.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering about the fire protection systems. How do you do as a commissioning purpose of fire protection systems? I didn't see your presentation. It just says HVAC, plumbing, envelope, power, and lighting. Can you tell me about little bit for fire protection?
Yes, I see no reason whatsoever that the commissioning process, and again, I'm focusing on ASHRAE, but Europe is pretty much on board with the same concepts. So there's no reason that process could not be applied to fire protection systems. And in many cases, at least in North America, the fire protection systems, with a few exceptions, are very, very prescriptive and very, very code-based. So there's not as much room for error. But I would commission fire protection systems. It's just that they're less likely in North America to be a problem. The exception is performance-based fire protection systems, such as smoke evacuation systems, which are not prescriptive. Every design is a custom design. They're also interdisciplinary. So the electrical system has to work, signal system has to work, detection system, which is probably part of signaling, mechanical system has to work. I would absolutely include those as part of the commissioning process. If I can give you an example, literally 3 weeks ago, I was at a hotel, fairly large hotel in Tennessee, US, and there was a power outage in the city. And I was in the hotel, actually walking down a stairway, and the lights went out. And that's illegal. It should never have happened. But the system wasn't commissioned. And then it was an awkward situation. I went through a number of emotions being in a darkened stairwell. Number one, it was irritating, so I was irritated. Number two, it became clear that was really unfortunate because I can walk fairly well and I don't have a cane, I don't have a young child with me. And then it became clear that it was actually my legal responsibility as a licensed engineer to tell someone about this. You know, it was a sequence of events, and I think commissioning could have solved that. Literally, what happened was the power failure did not trigger the emergency generator, and it took 35 minutes to find a human being who could figure out what the right switch on the generator was to get it to work. Imagine if there had been a fire. People would have been injured, certainly. And so that's my omission. I will put that on the next set of slides. So thank you for that.
Başka sorumuz var mı konumuza? Yoksa soru hakkını ben kullanıp oturumu kapatacağım. Okay.
Can I have 1 second?
Yeah, of course.
So, no more questions. You're shyer than I thought. That's fine. I'm not here to say, look at what the US is doing, look at what ASHRAE is doing. I'm here to say, here's what they're doing. what I've heard so far, you're all doing a good job. It can be better. Maybe take a look at the ASHRAE documents, but also take a look at the SIBC documents and other documents, those from India, and consider what really works best in your context for your environment, which is a cultural environment, an economic environment, a regulatory environment. You have to make it work, but there are lots of good examples out there to make the journey a little bit easier. So congratulations on what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing happening. It's excellent, it's outstanding. Keep up the good work.
And I have one more question for you, sir. For a last question, what will be your advices about how can we flourish the commissioning process and the commissioning opportunities in this land? How did you do it in US? What will be your recommendation for us? How shall we do it?
The fastest way to get anything adopted is through mandatory legislation, but it's also difficult. But if you wanted to change something overnight, that's how you do it. So I wouldn't rule that out, but I don't see that as a short-term opportunity. If you can get more and more certifications, that sort of thing that people value, to incorporate commissioning, that will help. So it's a win and a lose situation in the US in terms of LEED building rating system. Because LEED mandates commissioning, there's more commissioning going on. But because a lot of people see that as a commodity rather than a service, there's a lot of bad commissioning at almost no profit margin going on. So it's almost like be careful what you wish for, because it can usually go off in different directions.
Okay.
I think probably I would highly recommend case studies. I mean, the hospital stories are wonderful, and not everyone's doing a hospital, but a hospital story, a case study, documentation can become an office building. It can become a school and that sort of thing. And if you can start to see the benefits, and someone mentioned, and it's so true, it's really hard at the end of a building acquisition process and the commissioning process to say, this is what we did, because quite often it's what we avoided not doing. And it's harder to prove a negative than it is to show a positive. But I think case studies can do that. And so I love the, it wasn't a formal case study, but the project 1, lots of issues. Project 2, not so many. Project 3, even less. My question was, on project 10, do we not even have to worry about it anymore? You know, is everyone going, this is how it happens. This is the normal way of doing business.
Okay.
So you caught me sort of cold on that, but I think case studies to start.
Okay.
And just get them out. And it can't just be within the engineering community. It's got to be with the engineering, architecture, and owner community.
And the government, what do you think about, what is the
Oh,
role
yes.
of government?
Try to bring them in too, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure.
Mandatory legislation?
Yes.
Okay. Thank
Because
you.
legislation changes things overnight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What
That
used
comes
to be
from
legal-
government.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although, again, be careful what you watch for.
Okay. Backfire, huh?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your attention.
Teşekkürler. Değerli konuklarımız, bu oturumun sonuna geldik. Walter'a sertifikasını takdim etmek üzere başkanımızı sahneye davet ediyorum. Walter, we have a ceremony for you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Our president will certificate of appreciation. Tabii tabii. Ha? Tamam. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation. Greatly. Thank you. Appreciate it.